Hi, I'm David Edelman, a neuroscientist and paleoanthropologist, and welcome to the podcast On Consciousness with Bernard Baars. Roundtable episodes of the podcast On Consciousness with Bernard Baars were recorded and filmed at my parents' La Jolla home. These deep dives into the nature of consciousness comprise a special tribute to my father, Nobel laureate Gerald Edelman, whose prodigious scientific and intellectual output cut an indelible swath not just through neuroscience and consciousness theory, but across much of modern biology. In a sense, these podcasts are a natural outcome of all the discussions Dad and I had about the nature of consciousness and other biological mysteries over many years. We're here today with Bernie, acclaimed author in psychobiology, including his newest book, On Consciousness, Science and Subjectivity, Updated Works in Global Workspace Theory. Bernie is the recipient of the 2019 Hermann von Helmholtz Life Contribution Award by the International Neural Network Society, which recognizes outstanding achievements in perception by individuals whose scientific life contribution to the field of neural networks was proven to be paradigm-changing and long-lasting. Also joining us is Dr. Giedd, a child, adolescent, and geriatric psychiatrist by training. Jay is the Chief of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at UC San Diego, Fukuoka University in Japan, and at Johns Hopkins in reproductive medicine. His overarching interest for many years has been the brain and how it changes throughout life. As scientists, as philosophers, as human observers, under what conditions can we infer that some living organism is conscious? Consciousness is truly the difference that makes a difference. Today's discussion is about the rich variety of conscious experience by virtue of the richness of our sensoria and the capacity for the brain to pick this all apart and put it back together, both developmentally and evolutionarily. So today, we're going to try to unpack those functional aspects of the brain that are absolutely critical to consciousness. Getting back, Bernie, to kind of the functional anatomy, you had mentioned two structures writ large, Cortex and Thalamus. So just briefly, in a nutshell, Thalamus's role in all of this versus Cortex.
We tend to make the mistake of looking at the gross anatomy, which is the stuff you can see, right? And the gross anatomy sometimes is very misleading because what really matters is the connectivity of single neurons, and you can't see single neurons, and you certainly cannot see the synapses, right? So where the real action is, we can't see. And what happens instead is that we kind of get a mental image of the gross anatomy, and it's wrong. And so as I have begun to understand this problem, which actually I learned from Joe Bogan, who was Sperry's neurosurgeon early on, Roger Sperry, Joe said basically that the thalamus is not the center of the corticothalamic system because of the resonance feature, which your dad called re-entry. And it doesn't matter what you call it. Basically, and Joe, your dad's good friend, Joe Galley, put me on the spot at one point at the lunch table and said, I can't understand why point A in the cortex is connected to point B, and point B is connected to point A. And I understood, of course, that was a joke, right? Because if you're an engineer, that doesn't work, right? It's going to blow up the cortex because you're going to get this horrible resonance and really run out of control. But I think that was kind of a guiding question for your dad and also for Joe and others that they talked with. Why doesn't the cortex blow up? And so this concept of the cortex running near criticality is a worthwhile hypothesis, very important hypothesis, because this cortex is surfing the waves.
But the near criticality kind of implies too that it's ready to be influenced. Right? It's at a tipping point at all times.
That, and it doesn't matter where the input comes from, right? If you're a rabbit and you hear a cracking twig behind you, you first run and then you look. Right?
Yeah, back to and even the experience, of fear then is your interpretation of my heart's racing, like back
Yes.
to William James.
So I think we can say, at least in the case of the mammal, we have a sort of a macroscopic functional view, relatively speaking, macroscopic delivered via fMRI, delivered even by something like MEG, magnetoencephalography, which temporally is, of course, quite good.
Milliseconds
Instead of seconds, but not good spatially because it's more or less, in fact, you're always recording field potential recordings, EEG, on top of MEG. You never do an MEG study without using EEG electrodes as well. So we're limited there, right? Methodologically, we can't really get down to the nitty gritty. We can't look at individual neurons. We can see areas kind of lighting up and doing what they're doing and being more active at a certain point versus another, sleep versus waking, waking versus sleeping. But we can generally agree, I think, that in the case of the mammal, there are certain supercritical areas without which it would be hard to argue for conscious experience, although there are weird cases. There are the cases of the hydranencephalic kids who are literally born with little or no cortex, and yet some people, some quite virtuous people like Bjorn Merker, have pointed out, well, look, behaviorally, they look like they have the earmarks of consciousness. Let's kind of come to the point where we can say there's anatomy that's important, that's absolutely... It's kind of the sine qua non for the mammalian conscious experience. Cortex and thalamus get rolled into this. Greater detail, well, that's a work in progress. And as you said, Bernie, we can't really burrow down into individual neurons or even groups of neurons and study them in any kind of systematic way. First of all, it's very invasive, as we all know. It's, in order to do that right now, we don't have a technology that allows us to dig in without really...
We're getting closer, though.
We're getting closer.
And by combining all the MEG and EEG and fMRI and atomic MRI, that could be a step forward as well, integrating all the information.
So let's get back into this last segment, and I think we'll sort of wrap this stuff up. It won't necessarily be a pretty package, but I think it'll be a sort of coherent package.
Can I drop one word?
Sure.
It's pretty clear, I think, in terms of the evidence, that we're talking about the dynamic global workspace, a dynamic core, which is essentially the same idea.
And by the way, it's a beautiful idea, but it's also it confounds us because it's a moving target, literally.
Exactly right.
But I think it's a very important point because with Penfield's sort of the grandmother cell or the Jennifer Aniston cell, this notion of a single neuron controlling the memory, it's not how it works.
Right.
So that individual neuron doesn't contain it. But when you stimulate it, you trigger the whole connections, the whole vast webbing of that. And so people often misunderstand that we have one cell in our brain for this person, another cell.
Sure.
It doesn't work that way.
Doesn't work that way. But let's circle back. So let's take stock. So we've sort of set out some provisional contours of a definition of what we think of as consciousness, a definition of consciousness. We've talked about the varieties of conscious experience and the necessary, sensory apparatus that go along, the entailments. We've now talked about, via the global workspace, we've talked about some of the relevant anatomy. Let's end on something that we sort of started with. We did invoke memory briefly. We talked about the role of memory, but there are functional attributes that aren't in and of themselves, they're not the conscious experience, but they are also functional sine qua non of the conscious experience, and memory is preeminent among them. Some very profound capacity for a certain kind of memory. So I often associate, for example, a sophisticated episodic memory with conscious experience.
Oh, yes.
And maybe you can sort of unpack that a little bit, but this is a good point, I think, to sort of end the conversation, getting into the all of the functional underlayments without which there couldn't be a conscious experience.
Sine qua non being like without which not. For
Exactly.
What is the necessary minimum.
That's right.
Right. Episodic memory involves conscious experiences being encoded. Autobiographical memory, same thing. Semantic memory, same thing at a higher level of representation in association cortex, as we have now.
Right.
All varieties of memory, I believe, come in through conscious moments And that includes conscious moments of recall, for example, from long-term memory, and conscious moments coming in from the senses, and from sensory motor learning how to play the fiddle, all those kinds of things. So I really do think, after all the skepticism of a whole century of behaviorism, I really think that consciousness is the means by which any kind of memories are established.
Right. So now I'm going to say something that I think it provides a really good sort of punctuation mark for all of this, which is that functionally we can really say robustly here and now, and I think we at least us three can all agree that consciousness is a fundamentally biological phenomenon. Well, why am I saying that? One reason I'm saying that is for the very thing that we've just talked about. The fact that it is built upon substrates that perhaps almost certainly predated in some way, shape, or form. There are earlier forms of memory that certainly came well before anything that we might recognize as a conscious experience, but they were there, and it's an underlayment. And I think you can argue, and I think, again, us three would agree on this, although some people in neuroscience wouldn't necessarily agree, that memory is fundamental to the conscious experience, that you can't really easily separate the two. You can talk about memory in and of itself. So there are varieties of memory that aren't conscious, right? The brain responds and we do things behaviorally, but we don't have to be sort of aware, but yet our brain has a memory of it, and that's the basis for our performing the action. That's fine. But in the case of the conscious experience, you can't subtract memory from it. You need memory is fundamental to it. That's the first thing. I'm going to kind of expand our view briefly, and we will touch on sleep at the very end, and we're getting close. But I'm going to play the devil's advocate, Bernie. We've talked very much about a mammalian-centric view of the brain and of conscious experience in particular.
Mammalian imperialism.
Yes, that's very good. I like that. I like that term. But cephalopods. That's the last word. Well, they don't have cortices, as we understand. Their last common descendant, or the last common ancestor of cephalopods and us lived more than 500 million years ago and was something akin to a sort of a more complex worm-like animal, but basically a worm that didn't even have vision, perhaps. And so we're talking about a sort of a convergent event here, right? We're talking about a sophisticated nervous system arising in an invertebrate, an animal without a backbone, and really getting highly ramified to the point where the closest invertebrate in terms of brain mass and brain size, in terms of the number of nerve cells, the number of neurons, is a honeybee or a spider. Wow. And the number of neurons in a honeybee might be 1 million. Spiders closely following that, 800,000 to a little bit more than 1 million. The number of nerve cells, the number of neurons in an octopus nervous system, in a common octopus that is, 500 million.
But they're clever, aren't they?
They're super clever, and they don't seem to understand that the clam is a relative. They don't seem to get clams are not smart.
But they can solve problems. They can use the.
They have amazing vision, but they don't have a cerebral cortex. We haven't even identified something that's like a sensory relay, like the thalamus. And so here's the conundrum, right? And we're not going to answer this now.
I can not answer it, but I can open the question because within the last couple of years, the comparative people who study comparative brains, right, have essentially demanded that we relabel the bird structure of the bird brain called the pallium, which also exists in reptiles.
Yes.
And those else. And the argument, as I understand it, is that the pallium is grossly different from Cortex, and even under the light microscope,
architecturally
different from Cortex. But I believe that Harvey Carton and people like that.
Harvey Carton and Cliff Ragsdale.
Right. They're arguing that the connectivity makes it Cortex. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's part, yes, that is correct, but it's not the whole picture. The whole picture is that these guys studied the developmental trajectory of these nervous systems. And what they realized is that, in fact, if you look at the cells in a developing bird brain, genetically, and in terms of even the pathways that they take when they're pathfinding, they look like there are cells you can identify as cortical neurons, even though there's no cortex, and they're migrating radially up into the top of the bird's brain.
Do you know if they have myelin? Because that occurred about 250, 300 million years ago, so they might not actually.
I think there is myelination in bird brains.
Myelin being this insulation along neurons that speed up the communication.
As far as I know, they have it.
Interesting.
And so I think, Bernie, you're making a really good argument that we don't have to. We're not strictly corticocentric around this table. We have some allowances, right? Yeah. And I only brought up the octopus not because we can resolve that particular puzzle piece. We can't put it into the full puzzle right now because we haven't worked out the anatomy.
But how clever are they? I mean,
extremely clever.
I don't know if I maybe mix up this way, but they can open a jar.
And I can.
Maybe because
it's for another time. But
without a cortex, they can do.
Oh yeah,
it's a piece of cake.
Yeah, for them it's really good. They do observational learning. So the final learning, okay, right. So the final note though is to go back to where we started, and this is just the absolute last bit. But I think it's important to mention it, which is methodologically, and as Bernie has pointed out any number of times, and as you will almost certainly find in this book in any number of places, that sleep represents a really good contrast to the waking state in terms of what you might want to pull out as the functional aspects of the brain that are critical to the conscious experience. It gives us a lot of interesting clues.
This idea of the brain fundamentally being a prediction machine.
Right.
And in order to do that, we have to create an internal model of the world. Listen to Carl Friston's amazing stuff about the energy is sort of the fundamental essence of what a brain does. But this notion then is that our dreams are kind of weird because our brains aren't getting the B to A, sort of the sensory input. And so that in a sense, when we're awake, we're kind of dreaming, but several times a second, we're getting input from our eyes, our ears, our bodies, and that kind of corrects these models in a sense. And that's sort of the missing element between awake and asleep. It's kind of more of this top-down.
Right. When you're asleep, the cortex is sort of talking to itself more than
and this is
else.
relatively new for me, so I'm not trying to speak as an expert, but more as a curious student. Right. That seems really interesting concept that instead of interpreting all these details of weirdness of dreams that, as my role as a psychiatrist, did a fair amount of back in the day, that this is sort of a little bit more understandable in the sense of that the brain's model is pretty imperfect, but we constantly are correcting it throughout the day while we're awake.
That's right.
And it's this never-ending cycle that is part of the experience of consciousness.
Right.
Our model, our testing model, constantly updating it.
Exactly.
And how that fits into the memory part is still a difficult one for me, thinking of how poor babies' memories are.
Right.
Like, could they actually be experiencing consciousness in the same way that I am now? And I just don't know the answer to that, but I go round and round.
I have a provocative question on that, because consciousness is expensive, right? Biologically, it's expensive. If you assume that that requires cortex, for example, it requires more glucose and oxygen and carrying away toxins.
And to David's earlier point, even when you're sleeping, so people think of the sleep as turning off. You said it wonderfully. You said different patterns, different patterns of connection to sleep. But I mean, it's 20 to 25% of all of the glucose that we use, sleep or awake. That's a big percent. 3% of the size, 20% of all the energy.
Right. And if there were hominids, if there were some species of hominids different from humans who would be unconscious during dreams, it would need us, right?
They might. But I think, they might. So we'll leave that aside for now because I think, we're sort of, we're coming to the end time-wise. But I think to sort of sum up, I think we can all agree that we haven't really arrived at a perfectly palatable definition of consciousness yet, but I think we're well on the road. I think you guys would agree with that. We're getting there. In this particular segment, I think we've managed to sort of outline both the promise in terms of the ability to sort of observe these things, both in the context of particular behaviors which paint the difference that we might be looking for, that is the conscious experience, and also in terms of the functional anatomy that's relevant, cortex and thalamus and the mammal being the example, and also the methodological problems, what lies in our way ahead, right? What the road ahead leads us, and our limitations. And right now, we're still at a relatively early point, technically, I think, vis-a-vis capturing conscious processing in the moment. And it has to do with what Bernie said. It has to do with our level of resolution. I think we should leave it there. I think we've gotten a good start. And for now, I would like to thank Giedd and Bernard Baars for a really stimulating conversation.
My great pleasure.
On the nature of consciousness. I'm neuroscientist David Edelman. Thank you for listening and for tuning into the podcast On Consciousness with Bernard Baars.